do interest. something that happened to me versus something that happened to her. Somewhere. Yeah. So we'll try making you co-conspirator.
So I was an alternative host before.
Right. So that was something I could set up when I did all of the, scheduling on Zoom. But apparently I have to designate you as a co-host, not an alternative host,
Yeah,
and then I have to assign you to a room.
That's
So
weird, yeah, because it always like co-host next to my name.
I know, so
So-
that's why, yeah, I'm totally, but that's, well, we'll see, because that's what they wrote me back. Is that, when you assign an alternative host. But, so I don't know how to assign you as a co-host. Other than, I don't know if it's gonna change your designation. And they said, once I put you in a room, you should be able to move. So,
Right.
if can you, like, as soon as I put you in a room, if you're not able to leave, would you let me know with a text message to me or something? Okay. And so I'm going to carry on like given them, these week-long assignments. So the assignment for this week is environmental services. So that's kind of, it's mentioned in the chapter, but I'm asking them to really flesh this out because it sort of gets into the more issues thing. But we probably have to get our heads together and figure out how to keep up with the grading, and I probably need to help you out with that.
I got caught up.
Did you?
I didn't do milestone 1, but
Okay.
I didn't read half of it. And it was the revisions for the last
Oh, that's right. Shoot, I got a grade. So all right. So I'll do milestone. How about that? So I'll assign the final grades in milestone. And yeah, I don't know how many people resubmitted. Oh, look.
I got one email where someone had resubmitted the wrong copy.
Okay.
So I just need to have that.
Okay. All right. And so I had a good session. I guess you probably couldn't join, but I gave a lecture to the law school yesterday.
Yeah, join.
You joined. Okay, you were there. So that was pretty interesting, I thought. And I think, I know you don't want to like be a lawyer. I'm not going to law school. Okay. But I think you could, put together a project or, do something in collaboration with the lawyers around this question of, revising the, so I think, and I'm speaking a little bit spontaneously here, but I think, a theme for your dissertation could very well be, sort of, evaluating how the offshore resources are managed, in light of the very many things that are happening. And then you can bring into that, the research that we're able to do in the Gulf of Mexico and many findings there. And there are many other research topics or areas where you could go out and specifically look at, the way that, deep sea mining and blah, 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 blah is wind power, hazards, and, are posing challenges to, management of the marine environment that are outside the boundaries of the current marine management system. So I think that, that you would have a great deal of opportunity for scholarship there. You could certainly bring in some of, some findings, scientific findings from your own research, my research, the stuff we're doing with Exxon, the stuff you already did with MC20, and but then you wouldn't have to be tied to, me necessarily coming up with funded projects, because I don't feel totally confident that it's going to happen, given the current environment and the corona epidemic and, everything else that's going on. But I think you could still do a really valuable and, publication-worthy dissertation, with lots of research and thinking that wouldn't require that we get a, $500,000 grant to support your, 1C and things like that, which we're not happy. And we might, there's a possibility we might get some more monitoring data out of the, because you saw the stuff I sent into essentially like copy that proposal that we did for DOJ. So that's, in the wind, but who the hell knows? I mean, I thought we were going to meet, and then it's sort of like go through the cracks, and everybody's freaked out about the election, and who knows what the hell's happening in Washington D.C. So plenty of reason to be freaked out, but so anyway, that's the situation. See, am I actually zooming right now?
Fucking he ain't doing. I know that very well. Yeah, once I got a call, I got the beat too. I couldn't finish the song, I can go to sleep too. I want girl told me something else that creep too. That shit deep too. Going for a loop. I done got exposed to the line, way too young. I ain't paralyzed, but the street is turning on. I done on you moving. Baby, you make me run.
Okay, well, welcome to Issues in Environmental Science. It's the 29th of September. And we're going to have a lecture over taking off from material covered in Chapter 5, Ecosystems in Living Organisms. And so we'll be covering, I'll be taking off the material that's presented in Chapter 5, and then the teams will be breaking out and doing a 2-day exercise built around the concept of ecosystem services, which is very briefly discussed in Chapter 5, but which I'd like the class to delve more deeply into and try to apply some of the principles that are brought out in Chapter 5 and in today's lecture in trying to understand how ecosystem services help us to evaluate the contribution that healthy ecosystems make for not just the planet and the animals and organisms that live in those ecosystems, but also for human society. So we'll be looking at that, and you'll be looking at that in more detail, and we'll be discussing that. Yes, Darren. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. I just wanted to clarify. We got an email saying that the due date for milestone 2 was the 8th. However, in the module, it states the 4th. So I was just trying to clarify which date that is actually due.
It's the 8th because
Okay, thank you.
Because we had the change. I've allowed people to revise, or some teams needed to revise their milestone 1 submission.
Okay, that's all.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Sure. Any other questions? I also wanted to comment about teamwork. And I think by and large, it feels like the teams are effectively working together. And I would prefer not to, but as you've noticed, the way that the class is developing and the way that the work that we're able to do in these breakout sessions, which I think is helpful and useful. I've had a number of students tell me that they really like learning in that way. However, it does open up the possibility for individual students, the great minority of individual students, to shirk their responsibilities and foist off the work that's necessary for completing these team assignments onto their team members. And this is something that's difficult to police. And so what I've come up with is, the policy which I articulated in that announcement I sent around, namely that I'm not going to take attendance and I'm not going to require absences normally if teams are functioning well together. And if you as a team member need to be absent and you tell your teammates, hey, look, I'm sorry, I have a doctor's appointment or whatever it is, so I won't be able to attend class tomorrow. However, I'll make up for it by doing ABC. So if teams can work together in that way and work it out, amongst themselves, then I'm not going to, and Terry is not going to get involved in trying to police that activity. However, if teams may complain, so team members who feel that they are unfairly having to do a disproportionate amount of work, they can complain and say, hey, some members of my team are not showing up for class and they're not fully participating in the team assignments. Then in that case, Carrie and I will start monitoring the attendance of that team. And team members who don't attend, don't have an excused absence, may end up getting a 0 on the team assignment for that day, potentially that week. So that could be as much as a 20-point penalty if you're a member of a team where there's been reports of difficulty in getting everybody to participate. So that's the policy that I'm introducing. We don't want to babysit. I believe that the best solution is for team members to talk to each other and work things out. However, if that process breaks down, then in fairness, we're going to have that. So that is the policy going forward. And I'll put that into the syllabus. Are there any questions about that, or are there any before we get into the lecture material? So I noticed that we have 73 participants today. That's good. However, we have over 80
actual enrolled students in the class. So that means that there are people who are absent, and hopefully those teams for those people who are absent have, understand how the absent member is going to be able to make up the work that's assigned for class time. So any questions about that policy or any concerns about how the team process is working for you as an individual or for your team? Any questions about that, please? Either raise your hand or just start talking. Okay, I'm not hearing any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see how I'm going to do this. Go here. Okay, so today we're talking about Chapter 5, Ecosystems and Living Organisms. It's a type. Ecosystems and Living Ecosystems is a typo there. But Chapter 5 in Hasenzahl is entitled Ecosystems and Living Organisms. So we'll, the reading quiz and your reading assignment was Chapter 5. There's a lot of material in Chapter 5. A lot of the topics are covered very briefly, so I'm going to go into more detail about a couple of them. And then, as I said, there'll be a team assignment where you're breaking out into your groups and working on the specific questions that I've put into the assignment, which you can access in the module. So for the 29th, we'll be looking at species and populations, ecological interaction. And then in your breakout session, you'll be discussing ecosystem services article in Wikipedia. And you'll be answering these questions. How does the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment Project describe ecosystem services? And what is the advantage? What advantages do we gain by this conceptual framework? Thinking about ecosystems in terms of the services that they provide to human society, which services which are easy to take for granted unless you have this mindset of benefiting from ecosystems. And so I'd like you to dig into that a little bit, and this is by way of doing background research. And then on Thursday, we'll continue with this assignment, and I've assigned sort of more in-depth thinking and writing about this topic. So I'd like you to find other organizations that use the concept and discuss what the insights this brings to environmental management. And then I'd like you to propose some changes that would allow ecosystem services to be credited for the benefits they provide. So that we'll come back to main session, and I'll call on teams to talk about that. All right, I'm going to start out the lecture material by showing a video. Now this video hopefully will play over Zoom. I'm not 100% convinced that it will, but if you have trouble seeing the video in the Zoom thing, you can also find it on YouTube if you look for how wolves change rivers in YouTube, and you'll get this you'll get this video. All right, so I'm going to show this video now. Hopefully everybody can see this.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. That the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park.
Let me just interrupt and say that these are not deer, these are elk. But apart from that, everything is accurate.
And despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. Here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitat. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was a soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Okay, so was everybody able to see that video? I can't tell. Would somebody indicate whether or not that video streamed okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Well, that's a fascinating example of some of the principles that are implicit in Chapter 5 and in our discussion of community ecology. The way in which the actions and the influence of individual species can have a knock-on effect that alters the ecosystem, tends to make it more complex, more diverse, and ultimately more stable. And so there were a number of different concepts introduced in this video. One of the concepts was niches. Another one was ecosystem engineers. Another concept which didn't come out would have been keystone species. So these are all ways of describing the power that individual species have to affect not just their own populations, but the populations of interacting plants and animals that are together make up an entire ecosystem. So, let's dig into this a little bit more, and I'll talk specifically about the concept of habitat and of niche. And then also this concept of succession, the way in which communities are altered over time as a result of an interaction of physical processes and physical challenges within an environment, and then the way in which different species take advantage of that and alter the overall ecosystem. So this is something I think we've said before, but no single species can exist in and of itself. Species have to live together. And the reason for that is that no individual species can perform all of the functions necessary for sustaining life over multiple generations. So no individual species can both be a primary producer and a consumer. No individual species can be a primary producer and a decomposer. And so these different functions, which require radically different types of physiological function and adaptation, naturally require different species. And so for species to exist, they have to live in ecosystems. If we think about the development of the Earth ecosystem and go all the way back to the beginning, this sort of poses a chicken and egg problem. Which was the first species, and how how was it able to alter the environment in such a way that other species could come in? Well, that's kind of an imponderable question. But if we fast forward into the the present day, we can see readily many different examples of how the interaction of individual species within ecosystems gives rise to complexity, diversity, and actually to stability.
Question, Professor.
Question, go ahead.
I mean, as humans and being able to farm and all that, does that kind of make us almost like be like primary producers? Because I mean, like, what is that?
Well, no, I get your question. So, human beings are a very unique species, or they have a particularly widespread and impactful effect on the global and local ecosystems where they live. And, if we go back to primitive society or, pre-civilized society, for example, indigenous people in North America frequently used fire, and they would deliberately set fires to alter the characteristics of the forest to produce more deer, to have, create larger openings, more open spaces within the forest. So they were already at that time changing the environment in specific ways to benefit their ongoing lifestyle. And in the case of human beings, this was a particular choice. Wolves don't have any choice. They are a predator. They have to kill and eat their prey animals, which include a deer, elk, and other species, buffalo. And so, but the fact that a wolf population is going to live in a particular region, they're apex predators. They're few in number, but their impact extends across the entire ecosystem, and that's the intent of this video that we just watched. Human beings are a special case, and I'm going to talk about that probably in lecture on Thursday. But the concept of ecosystem engineer was introduced as well. Ecosystem engineer is different. So wolves are altering the overall functioning of the ecosystem in the sense that they impact prey populations, and there's a knock-on effect to the way that prey populations then alter their impact on the environment, particularly the plant communities that they depend on. Ecosystem engineer has a sort of a more broad connotation, and the example of beavers is given. Well, beavers are actually physically altering the environment because they cut down trees and dam rivers to create ponds and pools that protect them from predators. So they are actually altering the structure, the physical and biological structure of their environment. There are many other examples of ecosystem engineers, for example, coral reefs. So corals are organisms, as everyone knows, that build calcium carbonate skeletons, and those skeletons accumulate over long periods of time and create structure and substrate on the bottom that are, physical habitat and alter the environment. So ecosystem engineering is another way of thinking about how the influence of individual species within an ecosystem can alter the entire ecosystem. Okay,
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? All right, so within a biological community, each species performs a distinct function. You know, primary producers, grazers, predators, decomposers, parasites. You know, these are all functions that are necessary. I'm not sure if we need parasites, but they're certainly part of the ecosystem, and they do have an impact. And you know, the habitat is a principal way of describing how a species is able to exist in a sustainable multi-generational sense. So habitat is the, you know, in the most basic sense, is the location where the species can live. So where are the conditions that allow a species to live? So we don't have elk, for example, in Florida because the conditions are not right for them. We did have wolf populations, and we still have wolves in Florida, but you know, the conditions are very different from the way they are in Yellowstone, where the video described. But you know, this location can be very broad and can vary over time. For example, humpback whales live in the ocean, but the ocean, the services that they need, the conditions that they derive from the ocean, change over the life history of the whales. So the most plentiful food for humpback whales is found in the Arctic and Antarctic, and so whales will migrate, far to the north or far to the south, and feed on fish and other organisms in order to build up reserves of fat. Okay, but that's only part of what the humpback whale needs to have a viable population over many generations. They also have to reproduce. Well, if whales tried to reproduce in the cold Arctic waters, it would be much more stressful for their young when they were born. So what whales do is when they've built up enough reserves of fat, they migrate all the way from the Arctic down into the lower latitudes, as far south as Mexico and Mexican waters. So they go from the Arctic waters to the tropic waters, and there they can breed and reproduce. So their habitat is the ocean, but it's a very, very broad range of ocean. So when we talk about habitat, we have to understand that this is a very, very broad concept. Or, in contrast, there can be species that have a very, very narrow range of circumstances that they can live in. So, and in many communities, there are organisms that create habitat for other organisms. So certain species make habitat, alter the environment in such a way that other species are able to live with them. And an example of that, of course, are coral reefs, beaver dams, etc. So organisms alter the physical and chemical and even the thermal properties of their environment, which modifies the habitat of other organisms. When I say thermal properties, we'll think of the example that they gave in Yellowstone there, where the removal of the excess elk population allowed trees to regrow. Well, what happens when trees regrow? Well, the thermal characteristics of the environment are modified, and this has a direct effect on the populations of other species who might be more or less sensitive to high temperatures. So here's an example of niches. And what you're looking at is a tide pool. This is the Rocky Intertidal in the Pacific Northwest. And so this is a region, and in each you see these series of depressions. Well, these depressions are formed by these anemones. And so the anemones are living, each of these purple things are anemones, and they live in these depressions, and they actually help to form these impressions by excreting acids and by nibbling away at the rock substrate with their mouth parts. And so over time, they've created this series of alterations of the solid rock, Well, that in turn creates protective conditions for other species to live in. So there are limpets and that are able to move in and be protected in this altered habitat that results from one species. So that's one way that species can change the environment. Another way that species can change the environment is by, in progressive generations, altering the environment such that the ecosystem changes over time. And one way to think of it is it evolving? Is the ecosystem evolving? Well, evolution describes a different process from this process of ecosystem development over time. The process of ecosystem development over time is known as succession. And succession represents a series of stages that are changing. And so at each stage in this progression, each stage in this succession, the environment is altered. And just as we saw in the example of Yellowstone, different groups of species are able to survive there, and the physical environment can be altered as well. So a good example of this is an entirely uninhabited environment. Well, what kind of environment would be entirely uninhabited? Well, think of a lava field or a volcanic island. So this habitat comes into being. In the case of a volcanic island, there's an eruption of a volcano that builds up a cone which lifts itself above the level of the ocean. And so you have a rocky, barren habitat, potential habitat, with nothing on it. So over time, no soil is present, bare rocks, sand dunes, etc. So what happens? Well, individual species come in and they're able to establish themselves in this previously uninhabited environment. So a good example of the succession on a rocky, previously uninhabited environment would be the progression from lichen. Lichen are a particular form of symbiosis, combination of a fungi and algae that are growing together. So lichen are able to survive in very challenging, difficult circumstances. Well, once the lichens start growing on the rocks, they break down the rock material. They leave their body parts behind, and so there's organic material mixed with smaller mineral material from the breaking down of the rocks, and this creates a sort of a proto-soil that mosses are able to establish themselves in. So mosses are very tolerant of extreme conditions, and they can come in, they can arrive and begin to survive after the lichen have formed this primary alteration of the environment. Well, the mosses in turn produce more of this soil. They alter the environment further, and eventually grasses are able to have enough soil present to where they can put down their roots and establish viable populations. And then we get shrub, smaller plants, and finally forests. And so, this progression, very simplified in this example here, shows how the environment changes from its original primary state of having essentially no multicellular life. There's almost always bacteria present, but in terms of the large-scale characteristics of the biological community, you go from a very restricted number of species to slightly more complex, and then finally ending up in a forest that's potentially very diverse and exists over time. So, move in this primary succession describes the change, the development of an ecosystem from essentially an uninhabited environment to one in which there are many species present. Okay, once you've established a forest, is that the end of the story? Well, no, it isn't. So here's examples here of the barren substrate, lichen and small shrubs, dwarf trees, and then finally a spruce forest. Okay, so that's primary succession. And there's another example, another way of thinking about primary succession, which is secondary succession. And secondary succession is more like what was being described in the wolf example. but with some alteration. So this is a succession that begins following the incomplete destruction or reduction of the functionality of the ecosystem. And some examples are farmland, which has been abandoned, or areas that have been burned by fire. And under those circumstances, you've already got the basis of ecosystem, which may be more or less able to support large populations, but the soil is there, the organic material is there, the nutrients are there, so it doesn't take as long. It's generally more rapid than primary succession. So here's an example. This is taken from the book. So if we imagine that a farm field was planted and they were growing corn or wheat or whatever they were growing in this farm, and then for whatever reason the farm was abandoned. This has happened quite a bit, particularly in the eastern United States, where farmland is no longer economically viable for farmers, and so it's allowed to return to its natural state. And so this is a series of successions. So one of the characteristics of secondary succession, well, one of the characteristics of all succession, is there are species that move in called pioneer species. And these are species that, typically are able to grow rapidly. They're able to tolerate, ranges of temperature and availability of water. So perennial species, weed-like species, are the first arrivers, when you start from a plowed field. So you get these weed species come in, and they sort of stabilize the environment. They retain more moisture than an empty field would do. The decomposing detritus from that material creates more soil, more nutrients, and eventually you get trees that come in. Well, trees, different species of trees, have the same characteristic of there are some trees which are more tolerant of early successional conditions. So there are trees, for example, pine, the classic example of pine trees. Pines and pine saplings are able to survive under conditions of direct sunlight. They're able to tolerate dry conditions, and they grow quite rapidly. Well, so what happens then? The first, the next stage in the succession from a farm field is the arrival of the establishment of a early stage pine forest. Well, when the pines come in, they create shade conditions, and these shade conditions are conducive to the growth of other species. For example, hardwoods, deciduous trees, as opposed to coniferous trees. And so they grow up, and they have characteristics that tend to allow them to outcompete the pine forests. They create conditions of dense shade and which doesn't favor pines. And so the establishment of the hardwood forest would be a near final stage in the succession, the secondary succession from a farmer's field. Well, and there's one other component in all this, which is once the hardwood forest has established itself, it is vulnerable to conditions, successional conditions that can occur within it. So within the hardwood forest, you can get the growth of other species. Well, how does a hardwood forest maintain itself over time? Well, the classic example is that these oak and hardwood trees are resistant to fire. And so many climax communities, and this community is called the climax community. And so that's the community which will not be further altered by the arrival of new species. And so the climax community is maintained by periodic fires that come through and burn out the fuel that accumulates in the base and keeps it, sort of open like this. And so this secondary succession, moves from an organic rich setting all the way through to a forest. So that's an example of succession. We're looking at succession in two ways: primary succession and secondary succession. All right. So that's a way in which ecosystems can develop over time based on the physical conditions of the particular region, and also based on the circumstances of other species. Okay. So let's talk about more. So we've in discussing this example of succession, we see that tolerance and requirements, vary widely across different plant and animal species. And so different organisms have different tolerances for specific factors. For example, pine tolerate direct sun and are resistant to drying out when conditions of summer conditions would remove the amount of water they would typically get. So organisms have different tolerances for specific factors and may be broadly tolerant of different conditions. Steno is a prefix that means narrow, and so a stenohaline species would be one that has a haline describes the salinity of a marine ecosystem. So a stenohaline species would be a species that only tolerates a narrow range of salinity, whereas a euryhaline species would be one that tolerates a broad range of salinities. And so a euryhaline fish, for example, a tarpon or a sawfish, they're able to tolerate both freshwater or low salinity conditions as well as oceanic salinities. You could apply this the steno and eury prefixes to other conditions. For example, a eurythermal species would be one which tolerates a wide range of temperature, both hot temperatures and cool temperatures. An example of a eurythermal tree species would be a pine, as an example. So the tolerance and the need of species, which is implicit in their ecologic, in their environmental, which is implicit in their genetic makeup, is going to produce the characteristics of a species which allow it to survive in different habitats. Well, okay, so we sort of danced around this concept of niche. Niche was also mentioned in the wolves video. And niche is a way of thinking about where animals live, but it's a multi-dimensional description. Okay, so when we've described, for example, the need of tree species to tolerate different conditions of moisture availability and heat, that's one sort of description, one sort of dimension of the conditions under which that species can live. But if you start thinking about all of the factors that come into play that allow a population to either continue over multiple generations or be not be able to survive in a region, this niche is a way to think about that. So, what can a species eat? A carnivore, herbivore. That's a fundamental description of the species' needs. So an herbivore is able to eat plants. Carnivores, with some exception, have to eat living tissue. And they're completely different sorts of environmental or biological adaptation. So, and then, what can that species tolerate? How cold can it be? How wet or dry can it be? So after, within this combination, each of these needs or stresses represents a range of conditions that allow the species to exist. And so if you put all these together, you come up with a multi-dimensional description of where the species can live. And that multi-dimensional description is given the name of niche. So, the occurrence of species, the existence of species within a region infers that the possibility of other species living with it. So the occurrence of a species often produces other niches. So we're going to give some examples of how this would work. So let's think about, tolerance in terms of where species might be found. So we talked about eurythermal conditions. So let's imagine we have a fish species, and the fish species has an optimal range of temperature, sort of a mid-range of temperature. And this is where the species is most comfortable in terms of its physiological adaptation. So if you had within the environment a range of temperature from low to high, and it's not hard to imagine an environment in which there would be a range of temperatures, that species would tend to be most concentrated, most abundant within that optimal range, within that optimal temperature. As you get to the colder or warmer parts of the environment, the presence of the departure from the species' optimal temperature is going to produce physiological stress. So if it gets too warm, the species are going to start feeling uncomfortable. It's going to be detrimental to their health, and they're going to try to seek that optimal range. If you get completely beyond the species' ability to tolerate high temperatures, it's not going to be possible for the species, for that organism to live outside that range, and so you tend not to find any species outside that zone. And so that's a way of thinking about how a range of conditions would confine a species to a particular area or particular subsection of the overall environment. But that's not the only thing that happens, because species within this environment are also competing with each other. And we can look at the way in which species locate themselves, and that can help us think about the different types of species interactions that we can get. So here are distribution patterns for species. And we're looking at 3 different examples: random, clumped, and uniform. Well, what do these mean? A random distribution pattern, in this sense, means that you're equally likely to encounter a species anywhere you go, and the probability of doing so is a random event. And so this is a sort of a random pattern of species. Another pattern would be clumped. So species tend to like to be together. And that can be because the species create conditions that make it more likely for other members of their species to live with them. And so there are many, many examples in nature of clumped distribution patterns, clusters of organisms that occur together. And of course, the way in which these distribution patterns are played out depends a lot on the mobility of the species. So trees and plants, for example, are going to be distributed. They have limited opportunity to move if conditions change. Uniform distribution pattern suggests that each individual occupies about the same amount of space and tends to space itself out from other members of the species. So a distribution pattern which is uniform often indicates that each individual of that species has needs that from the environment that are in competition with the requirement of other species. So they, a uniform species distribution pattern tends to mean that the individuals are competing with each other for limited resources, and that competition produces this uniform pattern. And these distribution patterns, the ability of species to move around means that these distribution patterns can change over time. A classic example of, is bears. So bears are quite individual species. They tend to avoid each other. The only time they'll cluster together is during breeding season, when they, when they come together to either find mates or to compete for mates. And so otherwise, they're competing for limited resources, food availability, and they tend to chase other members of their species out of their environment, out of their local habitat. Okay, so let's look at, in more detail about how these kinds of things can affect the distribution patterns and the environment which is present. So I'm going to talk about a rocky tidal shore, and this is good because we have a range of conditions and different species are adapted to these conditions. And we're going to be looking at two species of organisms that live on the rocky shore. These are mussels, well, actually, these are two species of animals living on a rocky tide. Okay, so these are barnacles. There's two species of barnacles, and let's see how they interact. So the example that I'm going to give, this is taken from the coast of Oregon, and we're looking here at a Pacific coast shore. And you can see, from this picture that there is a high tidal range. The time this picture was taken, the tide was very far out. And you can see that, by, a sense of, how far up the beach extends, just what a range of tide is present. So what we're going to do to illustrate this picture among how barnacles create different conditions is we're going to focus on this rock here down in the in the water. So if we zoom in on that, we see the top of the rock and the bottom of the rock. Okay, at the top of the rock, and all the organisms that we're seeing here, most of them are marine organisms. At the very top, there'll be some mosses and some grasses growing, and mosses and grasses are not going to survive, complete immersion by water. So if we go down into this, we can see that there, just from the general picture here, we can see that the pattern and the color of the organisms changes, and that's as a result of three different species. So in the upper splash zone, we have mosses and lichen. In the middle zone, we have two species of barnacle. One is more tolerant of drying and high temperature, and the other does better when it's more moist. In the lower zone, we have anemones and predatory sea stars. So, the physical condition creates a range of conditions, and then the interaction of these species and their ability to tolerate different conditions creates zonations within this overall distribution. So here you can see the transition from the Calanus to the Bathyllus barnacles, and this is the species which is more tolerant of drying out, and this is a species which does better when it's moist. And so their ability to tolerate these two stresses, creates this zonation pattern. When you get further down toward the base, you have conditions that are almost always moist, and this allows anemones to thrive, and Anemones do better, when they're immersed all the time. And then there are predatory sea stars, which come out and they actually eat the barnacles and eat the mussels, but they don't do well, if it's completely dry. So, the barnacles are able to escape some of the predators, by living under these conditions of partial drying. So here's an example of 3 different niches created by, or a series of niches created by a combination of physical characteristics and the competition between species. My final example here is not from a intertidal zone, but this is from a hydrothermal vent. And this is pictures taken off the coast of British Columbia. We're at a depth here of about 2,000 meters. And this is a place where there's hydrothermal vent fluid. And the hydrothermal vent fluid is discharging underneath this little ledge here. This little ledge is probably 8 inches across, so this is a fairly small picture here. And you can see that there's a progression. What's happening here is that there's water coming out, or a special hydrothermal fluid that's coming out. This fluid has a temperature of about 200 degrees Celsius. So if you stuck a thermal probe under this ledge, you would measure extremely high temperatures. You can have temperatures of 200 degrees Celsius, well in excess of boiling point of water under 1 atmosphere, because the water pressure is so great at 2,000 meters that the water wouldn't boil at that range. Okay, well, 200 degrees, however, is way too hot for most organisms to tolerate. But there's one particular species of worm called an Alvanella worm. And these Alvanella worms live in these calcareous tubes that they build for themselves. And what they do is they come out, there are bacteria that are able to tolerate these conditions, chemosynthetic bacteria, and they live on the surface of this rock. So the bacteria live on the surface of this rock. There are these alvanellid worms that come out, and with these sort of feather duster looking plumes, they are grazing and browsing up the bacteria that are supported. Well, if you get further away from this zone, the temperature drops quite rapidly. So these worms are able to tolerate these high temperatures because the gradient, the temperature gradient drops very rapidly. So it's true that little wafts of hot temperature water would come out and affect these worms, but when they do so, they withdraw into their tubes and they're protected from that. As you go further up in this ecosystem, the temperature drops, and there are other organisms which are able to live in here. Tube worms, a variety of mollusks and other clams. And so this incredible gradient of temperature produces this gradient of ecosystem, from high temperature to low temperature. And this is an example of how temperature tolerance creates this range of conditions within which different species are able to survive. Okay, I guess we better stop here. I went on a little bit too long, and I'll break you up into your groups, and please get started on the assignment here. Any questions? Okay, Carolina, who am I putting you into?
The Planeteers.
Planeteers, and Carolina Riley, you're going into Only Clams. Darren, you go into
Aquatic Junkies.
Lee, you're in Green Machine, right? Dalia?
Dalia, I'm Planeteers.
Oh, I'm sorry. Katie, you're, which one are you in, Katie? Kate? Kate writes, which team do you need to go to? Penelope, which team do you need to go to?
Aquatic Junkies.
Kate, are you listening? You're muted. Still can't hear you.
Oh gosh, hold on.
Oh, here you go. What
Can you
team
hear me
you?
now?
Huh?
Can you hear me now?
I do.
computer was
What
going-
team should you go into?
Title.
Still didn't hear that. One more time.
Title number 6.
Okay, I should probably memorize that, right? All right, team title.
All right, I'm trying to open up the window, but it's not working, so I may have to leave and come back.
Okay,
There we go. All right, thank you. Sorry about that.
sure. James, do you need to be put into a room?
Yeah, I just got here. I was making myself some food. I stepped away from my computer for a second.
Okay, which team are you on?
Man, what's our name? Can't fathom. Thank you.
I can't move between rooms on my own.
Oh boy. Promises, promises. Okay. All right, well, I will I'll put you somewhere else. Let's see, I'll move you to, did you get into Only Clams?
Yeah, I just came back out to see if I could get into another one, and I only have the one option.
Where would you like to go?
Wherever you need me to go.
How about Fantastic Ferns?
Sure.
No, I'm still here.
Anybody?
So did you get a chance to look at the assignment? There's probably a lot more material in there that you can just sort of get, but try to work on those questions. You don't have to come up with like complete sentences or anything for this, but you know, you are going to have to do more work when we get back together on Thursday. So,
Okay. Awesome.
questions about this?
No, I got the Google Doc though, Eros.
Okay.
I found it.
Okay, good.
Yeah, sorry about that.
All right, take care.
All right, thanks.
It goes email, then it says download, and then it says Word document. I download it as a PDF document to my computer, because then it saves the whole document.
Oh,
Because if you just export it, it's not gonna do anything. Because if she's not in the group, so if you download like a physical copy, that's how I've been turning all my stuff in.
Okay, now I see what you're talking about. I didn't even fucking notice those functions. I only noticed the ones at the top of my Mac. So, okay, I learned something new.
You're all good.
Many functions in the digital world.
I know, I'm like talking about how awful I am. I'm like,
Don't feel bad because
No, it's okay. I literally did the same thing like the other day. I was like, wait, why isn't this sending? It's like, no, you have to physically download a copy to send it to Carrie because otherwise she can't open it. She's not a part of the group.
Right. Okay, so I guess you don't have as much time. So just focus on, you know, doing a little research, getting into that millennial assessment thing, and then we'll do more, have more discussion on Thursday. So we'll just probably get together for the last 5 minutes or so. All right?
All right.
So you guys able to dig into this millennial assessment?
It's in the Wikipedia article, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm reading through it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so, there's a lot of questions I put in to answer. You may not be able to do those in the amount of time we have left in the class, but at least get a start on it. And, then we'll do more discussion and more development on Thursday. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So is everybody working away here? I can't tell. You all present?
Yep.
Okay, found the material. So we're probably not going to have much time to discuss during class the Millennial Assessment Project, but we'll I'll keep the class open until 2 o'clock, and so we can have further discussion then. And then on Thursday we'll have more time for breakout work. Okay.
Sounds good.
With a bunch of different links.
I guess that's what I was wondering, is if we're supposed to be using this article or if I'm supposed to be looking something up.
Yeah, what I wanted you to do is to read the article because it introduces the concepts of ecosystem services, and then to go and use the links in the Wikipedia to find the Millennial Assessment, and then look at that, and you'll see. And you'll see as soon as you get into it that this is becoming a much more widely used topic and concept. Hey, Carrie, I joined your group because I think I made you co-host. Let me try again. Can you jump out into the main session? Sorry,
Yep.
folks, we're having trouble letting Carrie move autonomously from session to session. So. Okay, hey, so let me see. You're muted.
I can only go back into that last group.
Okay, well, I might have forgot. I think I forgot to make you co-host, but so I'm trying to do that. Let's see. It says that you are co-host. Can I make you host?
But then you won't be able to move around.
Let's see.
Can there be 2 hosts?
Okay, so now you're a host. So you should be able to go from room to room. Let me see if I can.
Okay, yeah, that popped up. And now you can't?
I can't, I don't see the breakout.
Okay, wait. Then I can.
Can you make me co-host?
What does it say next to your name right now? Nothing?
It just says me. So next to you it says host.
Then what if I assign you to team title and then see if you can move around?
Okay.
I don't know if that.
Hi, we're experimenting and trying to move from team to team. And this is because up until now, Carrie can't independently move from one team to another, which means that I have to sort of, without seeing what she's doing, grab her and push her into another room. And I've talked to Zoom and I've talked to the Canvas help, and nobody seems to be able to figure out how to do that. So I just came in to be able to see if I can get out again. And if I leave the room,
Someone else to do that if you wanted me to tell you.
huh?
I actually had to learn how to do that this summer. If you wanted me to.
Yeah, please, Kate. Yeah, tell me, how do you do that?
So basically, you have to have her as a co-host, and then you have to assign her to a random breakout room, and from there, she should have the breakout rooms button on the bottom, unless she's working from like a Chrome laptop.
No, I don't think she sees the breakout room button on the bottom. That's been the problem, because she would be able to do that, but she can't see it.
Because I know in my sorority, that's how we did our like recruiting and moving from room to room.
Yeah,
It should be on the bottom if she's a co-host.
it only works for Greeks,
Exactly.
like everything else. All right, well, okay, I'm gonna leave and see if I can get back in somewhere else. You guys finding everything you need? Found the article? Okay.
Now you're muted.
When you're in the breakout room, you don't see the breakout room button anymore. Because I was in the breakout room with where you put me, but I couldn't see the little button in the breakout rooms that would let me join some other room.
No, I don't have that. So I can leave. I have the option to leave the meeting or the room, and then I leave the room and get put back here.
Okay, but now you can go to a meeting, and because you're the host, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, phooey.
Yeah, because now you're the co-host.
Am I co-host?
That's what it says.
Oh, okay.
Me.
And we have somebody named Alexander Weinrich who's with us here. Who's Alexander? Are you here, Alexander?
I don't think he is, because he hasn't gone into his room at all.
Okay, well, I guess I will close the rooms. And I guess we'll have to call again and see, because somebody else was telling me, one of the students, Kate, was telling me that with her sorority, she was able to go into a room and still see the breakout rooms button. But unless I'm host, so I was in there after you made me, whatever you made me, and I couldn't see that breakout room button.
Yeah. No idea.
Okay. All right, well, let me close all the rooms. Feels like class is way too short, in this setting. It takes too much time to do everything.
Yeah.
Run out of time.
So I had a question regarding number 2.
Yes.
I don't see anywhere in this Wikipedia article about a synthesis report.
Yeah, you have to go to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment page, and there you'll see the synthesis reports. So it was kind of a treasure hunt thing. So if you go to the Millennium Assessment page,
I also don't see that in any of the content options.
I dropped a link to it in the chat if you want to click that.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, once you start looking, you'll see that this concept of ecosystem services is really starting to turn up in a lot of places. You know, it's about, 10, 15 years old, but it really, it changes the way we think about what the natural world is giving us. And then also thinking about what our dependencies are, as a human species and as a society. We sort of tend to think of, well, we're so adaptable, and we can, control the environment, we can, mine minerals and grow food and, build satellites and all these things. But, we sort of forget that we are a biological species and we're subject to the same sort of laws and rules of everything else. That kind of, I want to use a term which is a little bit judgmental, that sort of arrogance, sort of human arrogance that we're in control and we're in command of everything. Well, that's, true in a lot of ways. We really can, very much influence the environment, very much alter them, and we have done. But, we still can't escape our biological nature and the fact that we need certain kinds of things. We depend on the stability of an environment. We build houses right next to the beach, and we depend on the sea level to remain constant. When the sea level starts rising, well, all of a sudden, all of that, work and resources that we poured into building communities, cities, houses right next to the coast are suddenly jeopardized. And so the stability of the environment, it's, provision of water, it's provision of safety. These are all factors that, these are services that we get, that we extract from the environment. They tend to be unvalued. They tend not to have a price. And the fact that we live in a, capital intensive society where, the value of things is measured in, either their net worth or their ability to produce, money and returns, makes us take things for granted. And unfortunately, you can find many, many examples of people outstripping their natural environment. So ecosystem services is a really valuable concept. It's mentioned very briefly in the book, but I wanted people to go into it a little bit more. Okay, well, we're kind of out of time for the regular class period. So the students who have other obligations are free to leave. But as we did last week, and I thought that was valuable, I think we can open the floor up for more general discussion. And feel free to react to what you read about in the Wikipedia article, ask questions about the assignments, the specific components of the assignment that were given, or just offer other thoughts. Does anybody have any reaction to the concept of ecosystem services?
As I was reading how the ecosystems are treated and how they view it through this point of view, I was wondering, why was this never taught to me when I was younger? Because when we're in middle school or high school and you learn about ecosystems, they tell you how they work and how they function, but they don't necessarily ever get into how they affect our lives as humans and how they have helped us progress from what we were thousands of years ago to where we are now. And I believe that if we were taught how much nature has had an effect in our progress and what we are able to do today, I feel like we would appreciate it a little bit more, or at least in a different way. Because I don't think people realize all the time how most of the things that we use on a daily come from nature. Even our clothes or gas or yeah, all of these things that help the industry give us the material things that we use almost on the daily are closely related to nature, but I never really made that connection until reading this article.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're right. You raised two interesting points. One is this conceptual concept of, that we have provisioning, regulating cultural services that we have to have, that, that are essential components of human well-being. And, but, since they sort of come, they're sort of a birthright, we tend to take them for granted. So that's that's an important concept. I think the other thing that you say, which is really interesting, which I hadn't thought about, is this idea of how, what we're taught, what we learn is, is in, our primary education, secondary education, really gives us a tool set for toolkit for looking at the world. And if we don't have this concept of, we have a concept of ecosystems, we have a concept of the way the, the animals function together, but if we don't think of ourselves as being part of that, then we're not able to assess, what's going to happen if we lose, part of that, or if the ecosystem changes in ways, or if our activities change the ecosystem. So,
exactly. And I feel like we are taught kind of from the a spectator view rather than us also being a part of these ecosystems. And maybe that is also partly why we have destroyed them or kind of depleted them of resources to a point where maybe at some point there will be no return, right? Because at least me personally, I was never taught how much our actions actually affect ecosystems entirely.
Yeah, okay, well, good point, Britta. Any other thoughts on that, taking off from this, or thinking about the different services?
Well, I do know that conservation has been shifting from like a species dependent conservation to a more ecological conservation. So if you look at like the Great Barrier Reef or the Florida Keys, we have like marine protected areas instead of just protecting one specific species, because we have started to understand the ecological relationships between species, keystone species, and all of these factors that we have realized that if we, only focus on a singular species, we're not really benefiting the entire ecosystem itself. And therefore humans are affected because resources deplete and so far and so forth, tourism and stuff like that. So.
Yeah. Are people familiar generally with this concept of paradigm shifts and what paradigm shifting means? This is not something I plan to talk about, but how many people know about, the concept of paradigm shifts?
I'm sure you could explain it a little bit.
I mean, you mean like, yeah, I can't quite put a word on it, just some big concept shifting.
Isn't it like a major change in thinking that's like, it's not global, but it's large.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, well, the classic example of a paradigm shift is the realization that the Earth is not the center of the solar system, but instead the Earth orbits around the sun. And so, up until that point, everybody sort of thought of the Earth as being this central location. It kind of reinforced, religious beliefs and religious dogma. And then when people started, really looking at this in detail, Copernicus and Kepler and, the series of scientists who over a period of several hundred years, developed Newton developed the idea that, the realization that, oh, wait a minute, we're part of this system, this physical system. It changed the way we thought about the world, about the universe, about human place in the universe. So that was a major paradigm shift. There are other paradigm shifts that have occurred. So that, relativity and the theory of relativity and the idea that energy and mass are related, and that we can find this relationship in the nature of, how atoms are held together, and, how the universe is composed and how it might have begun. That was another major paradigm shift. The theory of evolution was a paradigm shift. We're realizing that the species and animals and plants that we see in the present day didn't just sort of spontaneously arise, but they came into being as this, as a result of a process that takes, millions of years to play out. So these are paradigm shifts. And I would submit, go ahead, somebody had a question?
All right. Could that be also the same as how we realized that we have an ozone and that it's depleting and global warming and all of that? I mean, is the concept of global warming and concept and climate change, is that kind of like?
Yeah, well, that's where I was going with that, is that, you know, it's exactly where I was going, is that we're sort of now, you know, coming into realization that, oh, okay, we're part of this system and we're altering the system in ways that are unsustainable. That, you know, we're using up resources, we're, you know, destroying components of the system, we're altering the stability, natural cycles, and in doing so, we kind of undercut our own, you know, stability, our own concept. So this, when we talk about climate change, you know, one problem with the concept of climate change is that it's narrowly focused on temperature, rainfall, that sort of thing. But the larger picture is the way in which human beings, you know, are altering the environment just by the virtue of existing and needing to continue to exist, and also by virtue of the fact that, you know, American society, Americans, you know, have not just a requirement for food and clothing and shelter, but also iPhones and plastic bags and all of the other stuff, you know, automobiles, fossil fuels, so that we, you know, we have all these needs, and in fulfilling these needs, we undercut the ability of the ecosystem to continue to provide those services. And so that is, I think, a paradigm shift that we're having to live through and that we haven't fully adjusted to. I mean, I don't think that, you know, certainly our political leadership doesn't discuss that. And, you know, we're about to have a presidential debate, right? Right now we're in the middle of a presidential campaign. And the first debate is tonight, as probably everybody knows. I wonder how many people are planning to watch the presidential debate tonight. So probably a lot of people take an interest in all that. Well, I just...
I have a question real quick.
Sure,
so, with this whole paradigm shift, do you think it'll require a shift in our government, like when national government decides to start incentivizing green energy and like smart energy? Do you think the consumers will follow because it's where capital investment is headed? Because I mean, I don't think that we'll be able to do anything, you know, from bottom up. We won't be able to do many grassroots things unless we can't get our national government like leading this. And like, we're America, we're the biggest, you know, nation in the world, and we're falling behind in so many aspects of green planning. And I mean, like China, they say that like they've overcome our carbon footprint. It's bigger than ours now, but they reduced their coal. Like they're not almost using any coal anymore. They're starting to switch to solar. Like they're making more incentives to buy solar, to invest in green. And like, how are we going to do that in America?
That's a great question. Well, where I was going with the presidential debate is that they've announced the topics that they're going to ask the candidates about. And once again, this makes me furious, once again, you know, they're not going to talk about climate or environment, you know, and so the you know, I don't know, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but the moderators that they put in charge of these debates going back, you know, because I've been watching presidential debates for a long time now, and climate and environment never come up. They don't bring it in. Once again, we're going to have a debate where it doesn't come up. Now, maybe the subsequent debates, it will come up. I hope it does. It did in the Democratic primary debates, but, you know, the idea that we can address this, you know, we can think about the future without addressing these problems is very concerning. And, you know, I think that the response to COVID by our society required sort of central planning and coordination that we were unable to accomplish. We're still unable to accomplish. You know, maybe a different administration, a different president might have provided different kinds of leadership. I hope that's possible within our democratic society. but you know, some of the indicators are not favorable because of the, you know, the resistance to mask wearing and, you know, social distancing. And that resistance is not just generally, but even here at FSU, you know, people are unwilling to give up their freedom in order for, you know, to keep everybody safe. And so, yeah, I think that's a great question, Mary, and I don't know the answer to it. I wish I did.
I had a kind of an idea, because how you said with, like, you know, with COVID and everything now, you know, we're all forced to wear a mask. It's that same idea about environmental, you know, sustainability. Oh my God, it's so much work. We have all this to do, you know, it's a lot more work for a person, right? But
Yeah.
we start to change the conversation about like how it is so economically beneficial to be environmentally sustainable, we might actually start to see a shift in our capitalistic society to more of a green energy. You know, you talk about packaging and plastics and stuff, and if you actually look at, you know, at our goods with fast good production and all this stuff, things are shipped all over the country just to be packaged, just to be made, just to then be shipped to America. So if you know, maybe make that conversation where if you like start spending, you know, it'd be more economically beneficial to stop all of that, and maybe, you know, we could start seeing an actual ecological shift in our capitalistic society.
Yeah, well, you know, it is the case that one of the things that society does is they put a value on components of society. So, you know, we put a value on nature. And in the United States, you know, we really have done a good job in terms of national parks and inventing the concept of national parks. But there's a limit to that. And there's a limit to understanding, you know, this competition between development and preservation, you know, which really, you know, doesn't have a satisfactory conclusion. You know, how we do that, what we value as a society is an elastic property. And, you know, I think if, you know, your generation, people coming up now who are going to take over, have the opportunity, the possibility of saying, oh, wait a minute, you know, it's not just, you know, the consumer goods and you know that, but there are other values that we would like to, you know, embed in society, we would like to preserve, then there is a possibility for a shift. But you know, I don't think that's easy. You know,
I mean, the fishery industry too. I mean, it's so weird that they're like digging their own grave by over exploitation. I mean, you know,
aquifers.
It's weird, you know, it's kind of weird to say like, oh, we're, you know, from an environmental standpoint, like you would want to prolong your product, you know, you'd make more money long term. So why are you going for the short cash grab here for overproduction when you're going to have less money? You'll never hit the same population if you overexploit, you know. It's just, it's a weird, you know, they're like digging their own grave.
Yeah.
So,
people don't think ahead. They want an iPhone right now.
Yeah.
They
Well,
want a car right now.
You know
They
that
want their money
marshmallow
right now.
experiment. You've heard of this marshmallow experiment where they take kids, little kids, and they say, okay, you can have one marshmallow now, but if you wait, you know, for 15 minutes and don't have the marshmallow, you get two. And some kids are able to wait, but most are not. They want that marshmallow right over there. It is, and you know, despite the fact that you could get two if you waited, it's, you know, the temptation of having, you know, the gratification immediately and be able to satisfy, you know, an immediate desire tends to outweigh future thinking. And you know, that is
Do you think it could also be because a lot of the conversation when it comes to climate change or being more environmentally friendly is centered around the bad consequences that's going to bring not taking these actions, rather the good consequences that could bring taking these actions? Like, I believe that if we talked more about how there is place for capitalism and reusable energy sources, there is place for, like Vanessa said, not overfishing so that we can fish for longer amount of time. Maybe instead of just saying, well, we're going to run out of fish, say, well, we can have enough fish. We just have to control how much we fish. just as an example, right? So with the kit, instead of telling him you can have more marshmallows if you don't eat this one now, I feel like we're telling the kids you're going to be punished if you eat this marshmallow, which maybe doesn't have as much as of an incentive for the kid to not want to eat the marshmallow, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It does make sense. And I think there's another concept, which is fundamental to American society and economics generally, which is the emphasis on growth. So, our economic system sort of depends on growth, how much economic growth. And that's how we measure economic output, is how much growth is there? How much does wealth increase? And with wealth, the ownership of property, etc. So growth is, embedded as a primary measure of economic success. Well, suppose if we shifted growth, just increasing the size. So that says if you're a farmer, for example, and you want to, make your farm operation better, buy more land, plant more crops, grow your farm, grow your capability of production. So that's sort of one path. There's another path, which is not growth, but betterment. And betterment is the concept that you improve the long-term sustainability of your farm. You make it a better operation. You figure out better ways to dispose of the manure. You make sure that your soil is being maintained so that you don't, when you have a dry period, that the soil doesn't completely dry out and kill off the crops. And there's a good example of that, where you've heard of the Amish farmers. Well, Amish, their farmland tends to get better and more productive generation upon generation. And, it's an example of, sort of prioritizing improvement to the fundamental functioning of the farmland. And, ecosystems and natural systems don't have any sort of specific goal. They don't have an agenda. But the natural outcome, very often, of succession is to create stability and to create a more diverse, assemblage of organisms. So stability in the physical realm and diversity in the biological realm tends to be characteristics of stable ecosystems over long periods of time. That's not a lesson that we've really incorporated in thinking about ourselves as members of an Earth ecosystem, but perhaps that's something that we could move towards, even if we're having to learn it this late in life, as opposed to having been taught it in primary school.
Yeah, I mean, the property, having humans own property is kind of a weird concept because, I remember I grew up in Miami, so my neighbor would have a mango tree, and if it went over to our property line, we had access to it, right? And so we had to keep that as whenever it got over our property line, we were responsible for that specific resource or whatever. So it's kind of weird. If you wanted to let ecosystems thrive, you still have to maintain them in a specific area, which is still another problem. That kind of I think of golf courses too, just like a kind of waste of space. If you just made like moss golf courses or made it more of an ecosystem instead of just one grass, one, it's very hard to really, assess all of these problems. And especially when people have property value, like they own a certain land. So you have to keep it within that area, which is kind of gives you another, it's another problem.
Yeah.
Going off of that, I was thinking about, I worked on a little bit of the Northern Territory of Australia, and I created a document, or I helped create a document to help plan for marine protected areas. And one of the criteria that we used specifically to assess the areas was just essentially looking at the amount in dollar form that the ecosystem provided, such as a mangrove system provides X amount of dollars to commercial fishing and to tourism and to this stemming from a specific coastal area. And I'm just wondering if we actually attached monetary values to these areas if people would actually pay attention more, because obviously it's easier to explain to someone this area provides $2 million of commercial fishing around the surrounding area or whatever, based off of raising young fish and letting them swim out and then you catch them or whatever. So I'm wondering if attaching that dollar amount, which sometimes is done, will actually help preserve the area and will help people actually understand the implications of their actions in destroying the land in the first place.
Yeah, well, that's right. As long as there's a system that allows a objective assignment of monetary value, conceivably people can, but it requires a couple things, doesn't it? I mean, it requires a strong central government or strong governmental oversight, or at least, communal oversight, where everybody has to agree. And there are examples of, fisheries that are managed communally, where, fishermen or fishers get together and together decide what the catch should be. The Maine lobster fishery is managed in exactly that way. And at some point or another during this course, I'll talk about fisheries and I can bring out that example. But I guess we're a little bit over time, so I'll go ahead and end the class session for today. I appreciate the discussion that continued. We'll try to leave more room for discussion when we get together again on Thursday. Okay?
Professor.
Sounds good.
One.
All right, everybody.
Bye.
Bye now.